Now I'm going to take the questions. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
I have a question about because of the New Testament showing some of the Talmud or Torah in your personal opinion, when do you think the separation occurred to go from Judaism to Christianity?
The question.
Obviously, at the time they knew about the oral Torah, so at that point they did know all about that stuff.
Right. The question is, when did the transition? When did the divorce go down? So it was not in one level, but it was on a series of events that happened. Some of it's hard for me to answer, and I would have put that up as a point because I do not engage in speculation. Those who know me and study, I don't speculate that Jesus exists. I can answer it if you ask me, but I generally only deal with things that are absolute knowledge. But the question is, when did the changes happen? So there are a few transitions that we could see. It's very clear that by the year 50, just as a point, the earliest writings in the Christian canon are the letters of Paul, chronologically. All of Paul's letters are written in the 50s, Romans being at the end. The earliest will be 1 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians is very unlikely written by Paul. But there are 7 that were absolutely certain was written by the same person, Paul. I'm sure he wrote it. There are 3 that are possibly Ephesian topic, and the pastoral epistles are very unlikely to be written by Paul. But here's the key. It's very clear. So what we do is there's a problem when you ask me the question is, there's a dearth of information. There's just a dearth of information for me to work from. So I have to reconstruct a narrative that would be consistent with what the evidence that we have before us. Do you understand? That's what I'm working with very little information because there is nothing. There is not a single non-Christian writing about Jesus in the first century, period. Or if they did, it just didn't survive. Nothing. What we find in Josephus was added in later, was added in by Eusebius. That's nonsense. There was a John the Baptist. Antiquities 5:2 is real. John the Baptist is a real person, a very important person. That's why the New Testament is going to want to attach Jesus to John the Baptist because he was well known, and therefore the association heightens Jesus' importance. And you'll notice that you could see the chain, the transition with John the Baptist. That is, we have him, of course, in Mark, we are introduced to Jesus as an adult. And John the Baptist is very prominent there. He doesn't name Jesus by name as being the one, but Matthew is actually naming him. Of course, Matthew has the John the Baptist already. It's much more embellished. So now John the Baptist is not only recognized that it's Jesus who's the one, but he actually then slams into the Pharisees. A parallel we can see over and over in Matthew. That means the anti-Jewish flavor is now heightened, heating up. Okay, so we're going to have there a very inflamed speech against the Pharisees by John the Baptist. You will not find that in the book of Mark. Now, what you have later on is, by the time you get to the book of John, very late, just to give you a sense of this, you could basically say that the first earliest New Testament writing is the year 50. The book of Mark is written about 15 years later. Matthew and Luke are written 15 years later than Mark, and the book of John is written about 15 years after the book of Matthew and Luke. So what we can look at when we look at letters of Paul is we can very clearly see that the people who are joining the church are Gentiles. They're not Jews. So it's very clear, I say it's very clear, again, from this information, we're trying to cull from it, and we're also looking, you say, well, how do you prove anything for the New Testament? You don't believe in the New Testament. So, but the point is that you understand that problem. So that there are criteria we can use, that there are some things that are true. One of the most important things we're going to look for is what's called the criteria of embarrassment. If something is terribly embarrassing to the church, it's very unlikely someone invented the notion that Paul is screaming at Peter to his face in Galatians, and that there's this massive war where Paul basically, in every letter, has more enemies than friends, and he's fighting them on every front. Okay, it's very unlikely someone would have invented that. It's extremely unlikely. So therefore, you could be sure that Paul had more enemies than friends. That was very clear. And his enemies were not Jews. I mean Jewish Jews. They were Christians. Followers of Jesus who believed that Paul was an absolute fraud, a Johnny-come-lately, made it up, has no authority whatsoever. And that's why Paul's going to push. I'm an apostle. What I have is directly from Jesus Christ. That's why he's pushing that. He's pushing back. That's what's very critical. We look at Paul's writings, he is trying to say, no, what I have is directly from Jesus. His itinerary is very different than what we find in Acts, very different. It's very different because he doesn't need to be going down to Jerusalem to check with anyone. He's going to circumcise Paul, go and circumcise Timothy after what he wrote in Galatians 5. He's not circumcised. This is a whole different story. But the accusation, by the way, we know this also from the church fathers very clearly. The Ebionites, early church Christians, hated him, thought he was an absolute fraud. He had no authority whatsoever. So, but what's happening there is Gentiles are coming in. So as Gentiles are coming in, they need to be spoken to in a language that they can understand. It was a time, just so you understand, that Judaism was extremely popular. Now, it was a very difficult time to live in the land of Israel, but there was an enormous amount of conversion to Judaism. There was one other point. Whenever I teach history, it's something that's extremely important. What you need to do is you've got to leave your 21st century brain behind. Just get it out of it. You need to understand the ancient world. In the ancient world, there was only one monotheism, that was Judaism. In the Greco-Roman world, when we talk about Greco-Roman world, we are talking about a period from 200 BCE to 200 CE. In that world, there was no monotheism but Judaism. Okay, it's very important to understand. Another thing about the ancient world is in the ancient Greco-Roman world, there were no books associated with religion. Only the Jews had it. The idea of a book, the idea of morals, that your God told you how to behave, was inconceivable to the Greco-Roman world. Inconceivable. The Zeus had nothing to say about how you behave. He was sleeping around with everybody. He was getting every virgin pregnant. So what is he going to tell you about how to behave? So it does not mean that people of the ancient world were immoral, but they did not get their morality from their gods, and they thought that was absolutely preposterous. They received their moral understandings from the Western philosophers. They understood from Socrates and so on. That's where the source of morality. The idea that religion and morality was somehow combined, that was inconceivable. But you could see the temptation of the monotheism is already drawing them in, and there's just a tremendous amount of conversion to Judaism. Now, if someone wants to convert to Judaism, what might make them go, well, I don't know. I kind of believe in Judaism, but I don't know if I want to convert. What might get in the way? What might be the obstacle? Circumcision for 50% of the population. I don't know. And back then it wasn't like they had anesthesia or anything. Whatever. It was a flint. It was not. And what was the whatever? And what was the other thing? What's the other thing? Circumcision and keeping mitzvahs, exactly. And that's really what Acts 15 is. That's what it's all about. So what Christianity explodes is it was perfect. What it's offering Gentiles is you get the Judaism. I mean, when the Roman Senate is electing a horse to the Senate, how frum can you be? How religious can you be? I mean, you just can't take this serious. Caligula is a deity during his lifetime. Caligula is emperor from 37 to 41. I mean, you just can't. So Judaism is very attractive. The Romans didn't quite get Judaism completely, but they had an enormous amount of respect for Judaism because of its antiquity. It's just been around forever. They did. So here we're already seeing the tension. But the tension there in this early stage is what's happening is that the people are believing in Jesus, that Jesus rose from the dead. Exactly what their belief about how that Jesus rose from the dead, the early stage is unlikely to believe in any kind of physical resurrection. And we can see of course, in Paul, the very most important chapter on the resurrection. We all know 1 Corinthians 15. So Paul's going to describe the resurrection, but Jesus' body that's resurrected is not the same body that is the natural body. It's a spiritual body. I want to be clear about that. It's a spiritual body. It does not. Paul is not in 1 Corinthians 15 saying that it's some sort of ghost. That is not what he's saying. But he's saying it's different. It's a different body, but it's a body. That means both words matter. This is critical. Spiritual and body, they're both, but it's just not the same of the seed that's put in the ground. That's the metaphor. But it's still, we don't have, when we get to Mark, we don't have a resurrection account. It's not there. Mark ends, the women were so frightened, they ran, and that was it. The last 12 verses of Mark were added in much, much later by scribes who found that Mark ending without a resurrection account was somewhat unsatisfying. So what happened is the real divorce begins to push. no doubt when Christians are going, okay, so we believe that the Messiah died for our sins and somehow rose from the dead, but the problem is there's not a single Jewish source anywhere that suggests that. Zero. We have not one text anywhere. I mean, when we say text, I'm talking about graphic text. We use the word, scholars use the term graphic, not in a pedestrian sense. Graphic text means that a clear text. The Messiah is going to be killed for your sins, going to rise from the dead. If you believe in him, you're saved or not. That's graphic. We're not. When you're talking about your eternal salvation, we're not looking for ambiguous text. There are, but that's not what we use to determine our theology. There was zero. So what they had to do is search through the Bible, try to find any kind of text that could possibly be construed as speaking about them. What they did was they found texts that had nothing to do with the Messiah, had to do with someone else or someone else's, and then they no doubt confronted the Jews with this. We see Isaiah 53 being used in the New Testament. The reason why Christians can't concede Isaiah 53, unless they're like Bruce Metzger did, but generally can't, is because it's in the New Testament, because Philip was using Isaiah 53 to convert a eunuch from Gaza. So that's it, it's done. Isaiah 53 is now canonized as the text. So there's no doubt that the sparks began to fly at that point. The real divorce, in really two separate ways, was really the Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba revolt takes place long after the destruction of the temples, the year 70, Masada. The Qumran caves, Qumran was destroyed in 68, second temple destroyed in 70, Masada 73. But then what we have is this very revolt that is initially very, very successful, and then it's a disaster. I mean, a horrible disaster. And we're talking about from 132 to 135. So here the Jews have recaptured Jerusalem under a leader. And many people believe that potentially he could be the Messiah. But what happens is you have now a war between the Romans and the Jews. The Romans were not anti-Semitic. It wasn't personal. This is not Luther. They didn't hate the Jews. We were just talking past each other. You see, they didn't. That's another important thing. Rome was not anti-Semitic. They just didn't get, because the notion of Greco-Roman paganism was extremely eclectic. Extremely. The gods didn't care who else you worship. The idea you worship one god, no other, was absolutely ridiculous to them. So therefore, to them, putting up a statue on the Temple Mount of Zeus was like, why would the Jews care? The Jews went berserk. You understand? So they did, what do you care? Because then it wasn't part of their orientation. But when we come to the Bar Kokhba revolt, and when the Christians are siding with the Romans against Jews, because obviously the Christians, some Jewish maybe, whatever, were obviously going, Bar Kokhba can't be the Messiah because we already believe in Jesus. So that means during the Gaza war that's going on, let's say, that we just had now in Israel, that went on 50 days, if you're supporting Hamas, it's over. We can get into an argument about a lot. But, when our kids are being slaughtered, it was a slaughter, you're supporting Hamas, this is done. That's when the divorce occurs. Now, there are further levels of divorce that will occur, that is with the oral law issue. And it really came down to Easter. The Easter issue is very big. People don't realize this, but in the Easter we find in the 2nd century, celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. But naturally, in order to celebrate Easter, they would celebrate on Passover. So they would ask the Jews when Passover is. Now, there's a difference between the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic means Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's a compression of two words mean the same view. And John. John has Jesus crucified on the 14th day of Nisan, and the Synoptic Gospels have Jesus crucified on the first day of Passover, the 15th day. John was always the favored gospel. Okay, just know that. Just the way it was in the church. Everybody loved John. Okay, it was everybody's favorite. It was considered the most spiritual gospel. So therefore, they would celebrate on the 14th day. There were some sects that actually would go with the Synoptics, but generally speaking, they would go with John's. Of course, they have the whole concept of Jesus being the Lamb of God. That's where it comes in. And therefore, what happens is the church would have to come. So people like Polycarp, he celebrated Easter on whenever the Jews said it was the 14th day of Nisan. Well, that means you're relying on our oral Torah. Where do you know what day of the month it is? Because we say so. I mean, you say, what do you mean? I thought it's a new moon. Well, the problem is, the reason why the oral Torah is necessary to know what month it is that we know the month by the new moon. But the problem is that Torah says that Passover must come out in the springtime. Well, the moon does not control the seasons. The sun does. Okay? So what happens is you have the lunar month, the lunar year is 354 days because it's average 29 and a half days. So you have 300, which means you lose 11 and a quarter days because what's called the tropical calendar, the solar calendar, is 365 and a quarter days. So that means every year it's moving backwards. So the Jews determine when to intercalate, which means to insert an extra month in order to keep them together. Now, in order to do that, the Torah doesn't say you have to have 12 months in a year. We don't have such a commandment. So therefore, we had to add a month. But how do you know how to do that? So the answer is you have to have oral Torah for that. Because the oral Torah tells us, you see, the information you need to have in order to make sure that you have a perfect calendar is you have to know the precise length of synodic month, exactly. I mean, you have to know it exactly. You may not realize this, but they actually correct very often years. They'll add a few seconds because the calendars we're using are off. Okay, and in 1582 they added 11 days. I mean, in the Julian calendar they added 3 months. No one had a perfect calendar. There were good calendars out there. The Mayans had good calendars. Nothing, but we have the Talmud, and the Talmud tells us in Tractate Rosh Hashanah that we have this from Moses directly, the precise length of a synodic month, and that length is precisely 29 days plus a half a day, 12 hours, and of the 13 hour, you divide the hour into 1,080 parts. 1,080 is a number that was used because 1,080 is divided by everything, just about, and it's 796 over 1,080. So therefore, now we can't work with fractions, we have to work with decimals. So the exact precise length of a synodic month, according to oral Torah, is 29.53059, period. All right, NASA in 1988 went up with a satellite, they measured it, and they found what the Talmud said is exactly correct. Okay, now, what happens is, well, either the Jews got really lucky, and we just guessed it or not. But the key is, the church did not like the idea of relying on our oral Torah to determine when Easter would be, their holiest holiday. So therefore, at the Council of Nicaea, this was very big. They said, forget, we're not going with Passover, we're going with the vernal equinox, and that's it. And that was the divorce. But Bar Kokhba, I would say, would be the real, if you support Hamas, you got it.